"Oh, my dear sir," said Don Antonio, "God forgive you for the offense that you've committed against the whole world in attempting to restore the funniest madman in it to his senses. Don't you see, sir, that the benefits of Don Quixote's recovery can't be compared with the pleasure that his antics provide?" Hey everybody, thank you for watching today. We are talking about Don Quixote by Cervantes, specifically part 2, which came out 10 years after part 1. You can go back and look at my video on part 1. It's got some age on it now, but if you want to start there and then watch this video, by all means do so. I'll put the link to the whole Western Core Series playlist down below. So we're continuing to make our way through these sort of eternal pillars in the Western literature. Now we're at Cervantes. Before this, we took a look at Shakespeare's Hamlet. Next, we'll be looking at John Milton's Paradise Lost. But I want to pause for just a second. I mean, consider how lucky we are to even have this book. There is a joy that I've found. There's a thrill, a joy, an exultation every time I sit down to read the Quixote. And there's an energy that crackles through every sentence of its prose that makes me so grateful to be a reader and to have connected with such a monumental work of literature. Greece will always have Homer. Italy will always have Dante. England will always have Shakespeare. Germany will always have Goethe. America will always have Melville. France will always have Proust. Ireland will always have Joyce. But Spain has Cervantes. A biography of Miguel de Cervantes is No Ordinary Madman, The Life and Times of Miguel de Cervantes by Donald P. McCrory. This is a Dover edition. Just from my little notes, this goes over so much and really highlights the man behind the work and not just his ultimate creation, Don Quixote. And also, I would say, Sancho Panza. This tells the story of an affluent family gone downhill, a fortunate Jesuit education for the young Cervantes, his exile from Spain, how he joined the army in Italy. He was maimed in war. He lost the use of his left arm. He was taken captive by pirates. He was imprisoned in Algiers. He spent much time around Moors and Muslim peoples, which ultimately he credits the history of Don Quixote to none other than a Muslim, a Moor, Cid Hamete Benengeli. He attempts to escape 4 times. A lot of these things can be combed out of his novellas, his short stories, and exemplary tales. He's finally ransomed and freed. He tries to maintain employment in court. He marries a girl half his age. He has a passion for the theater. And we only have 2 extant plays of his. And really, he sort of failed as a playwright. But a lot of that enthusiasm for that form does come into play in the Quixote. His contemporary and rival is Lope de Vega. He's adamant about Christian morals, love, fate, and providence, appeals to every human heart. And that's Cervantes' belief. He ends up moving miles away from his family in order to write, but No Ordinary Man I recommend as a Cervantes biography. But of course, the great Cervantes scholar Jean Canavaggio, whose book Cervantes won the Prix Goncourt in 1987, he makes a great statement. He says, "From Dickens to Melville, from Flaubert to Dostoevsky, from Kafka to Joyce and Garcia Marquez, the modern novel has tirelessly returned to this epic parable." Harold Bloom, in his book Genius, a mosaic of 100 exemplary creative minds, he puts Cervantes in the highest luster. He's kind of playing off Kabbalah and the Sephirot. He puts him up there with with Shakespeare, which for anyone who knows the Bardolator, the supreme Bardolator, Bloom, that is a high ranking. He says, so original is Don Quixote that nearly 4 centuries later, it remains the most advanced work of prose fiction that we have. The combined influence of Cervantes and Shakespeare, who died on the same date, overdetermines the entire course of subsequent Western literature. Roberto Echeverria, who is a sterling professor of literature at Yale University. He has this case book which goes along with his class, which is actually available for free online through Yale Open Courses. He says, Cervantes' protagonist has had such lasting appeal because he embodies a modern yearning to shape one's life according to one's desires, together with the confidence that such a thing is possible. I think that right there targets the root of its lasting appeal more than anything else that I've read or heard. Cervantes' most radical creation is the character of the narrator of Don Quixote, who styles himself a sort of editor of the story, presumably first written by Arabic historian Cid Amete Benengeli and translated into Spanish by several translators. And we'll talk a little bit, just as I did in part one, of these metafictional frames that Cervantes employs. He anticipates and becomes a precursor to Sterne and Tristram Shandy, all the way through Calvino and other people who employ these elements of metafiction. In James Wood's collection, Serious Noticing, which I actually got for Christmas last year, he has a great essay called Don Quixote's Old and New Testaments. And he says, Don Quixote is the greatest of all fictional inquiries into the relation between fiction and reality. And so a good deal of the novel's comedy is self-conscious, generated when one or more of the characters seems to step out of the book and appeal either to a non-fictional reality or directly to the audience. Vladimir Nabokov found it cruel and never really reconciled himself to the novel. And it seems that Stephen Moore, in his second volume, in his alternative history of the novel, which I'll turn to in a moment, also read through Nabokov's lectures on Don Quixote. And Moore also highlights a lot of the cruelty that a lot of people, such as myself, get carried away in the romanticism and the love for this novel and kind of overlook. Cervantes joins that select company of writers, including Milton, Montaigne, and Pierre Bayle, who delight in slipping blasphemy in through the tradesman's entrance while noisily welcoming divinity at the front gate. That's Wood. I'm finding more and more, because I've never really read a lot of his stuff until I got this collection of essays. He's got some great one-liners, such as that one. It is a shame that many readers never get to this second volume, which is both funnier and more affecting than the first, and I 100% agree. And it's nearly unanimous amongst critics and authors and other people who have talked about the Quixote. The second part, you find this confident, empowered Cervantes at work. And there are reasons why, I believe. And we'll talk about those here in a little bit. But certainly the second part is even better than the first. And it's just a treat. It's such a treat for the reader. And it's kind of tantamount to Proust. And even in this essay by Wood, he starts off with talking about the likeness of the windmills in Don Quixote and the lime blossom tea at the very beginning of Proust, because they both happen very, very early on in long books. And a lot of people only associate with those. I've seen people say stuff regarding Proust, such as, I just don't get what the big deal is about this lime blossom tea. That's going to happen if you just stop with the first volume. But just like Don Quixote, it gets better the more you go along. The same holds true with Proust. Each book starts to get better and better, at least in my opinion, and from several others I've talked to. In Harold Bloom's Western canon, he calls Don Quixote the play of the world, and he says that Cervantes is the only possible peer of Dante and Shakespeare in the Western canon. Only Cervantes and Shakespeare occupy the highest eminence. You cannot get ahead of them because they are always there before you. Cervantes, like Shakespeare, they have anticipated nearly every turn of our humanity. Confronting the strength of Don Quixote, the book, the reader is never lessened, only enhanced. That is not true in many moments of reading, say, Dante or Milton or Jonathan Swift. Cervantes' masterpiece, which for Unamuno replaced the Bible as the authentic Spanish scripture. Elsewhere, Bloom has talked about how Dante's Commedia is a third testament. And in the same way, he's following on the heels of the great Spanish philosopher and critic Miguel de Unamuno. And he's saying that, Unamuno said that Cervantes' masterpiece became the Spanish Bible, basically. Probably only Hamlet spurs as many variant interpretations as Don Quixote does. And critics of the Quixote of Cervantes are almost unanimous in that. Cervantes, with all his ironies, is in love with Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. And so is any reader who loves reading. From one of my favorite works of literary criticism, Eric Auerbach's Mimesis. You've heard me talk about this over and over again. He has a chapter in here, The Enchanted Dulcinea. He says, it is much more difficult to determine the position of the scene and of the novel as a whole on the scale of levels between tragic and comic. And I think that gets at the root of what Bloom is talking about with Don Quixote spurring on so many different variants of interpretation, because there's this scale that we tend to slide around on between the tragic and the comic. Like, what is this exactly? And with my opening quote, I think that captures that as well. Like, wait, is this really comedy, or is it tragedy wrapped in comedy, as so many comedies actually are? Does his madness give him an understanding he could not have attained in soundness of mind? I think that's a great question to take into your reading of Don Quixote, and just keep that above it. Let that drive your thoughts. Does Don Quixote's madness give him an understanding he could not have attained in soundness of mind? And furthermore, what is that understanding? And finally, like I said, from Stephen Moore's second volume, the novel An Alternative History, Moore opens up this second volume with chapter 1 is the European novel. Again, this is 1600 to 1800, and he starts with Spanish fiction. I think this is a very wise choice. So the first 20 odd pages are pretty much devoted to Cervantes and Don Quixote. He says, no character in literature has been more misunderstood than Don Quixote, usually because readers latch on to one aspect of his character and ignore Cervantes' multiple ironies, stripping the benighted knight of his 16th century context and dressing him in their own ideals and aspirations. Whatever else it may be, Don Quixote Part 1 is unquestionably about the art of fiction, both writing it and misreading it. It contains more discussion of books, literary theory, and advice on writing than any novel I know. And I said as much in my video on Part 1. Faulkner claimed to read it once a year. John Barth once a decade. But then Moore starts to strip away some of the romanticized criticism and thoughts of the Quixote and really has us evaluate the implications and the ramifications of Don Quixote's madness, and he links it to religious nuts, as he refers to it, and he shows that the author Cervantes wants us to admire Don Quixote, and this is italicized to convey that the author wants us to admire the book, but not Don Quixote, unitalicized, meaning the character, which is a very, very striking thought. Moore tends to reject the romantics like Bloom and Unamuno ahead of him. Some call it the first novel, which it certainly is not. I mean, that's the whole point of Moore's study volume across these two volumes, is that the novel was birthed in antiquity, basically. And he also says that it is not the greatest novel ever written, because its many errors and inconsistencies disqualify it from that honor. And parenthetically, he says, is it too much to ask that the greatest novel be as technically accomplished as the greatest painting, the greatest symphony, etc.? And he says, it can be considered the first modern novel, however. And one thing that Moore is getting at there about saying, that it's littered with errors and that, in his opinion, it's not the greatest novel because of that. I think it was maybe 2001, 2003, somewhere in there. The Nobel Institute did one of the most far-ranging polls of, I think, 100 renowned writers to ask them what their favorite book of all time was. And by far, the choice was none other than Don Quixote. One of the greatest ways to understand the two books of the Quixote is through the lens that Echeverria of Yale gives us, thinking about the historical context. The first book, which was published in 1605, sort of had its foot in the Renaissance, whereas the second part, or the second book of the Quixote, had its leg in the Baroque. And the differences of the Renaissance and the Baroque really do show up in these two different books. Now, there was a lacuna of 10 years in between, and during that time, there was an apocryphal Quixote, or a false Quixote, that came out by someone who was using a pen name of Avellaneda, and that apparently came to Cervantes' attention when he was about partway through the second part of the Quixote, and this caused him to not only incorporate the historical veracity of this apocryphal Quixote into his authentic Quixote, which again just added another layer to the metafictional framework that he had already worked out with all these different editors and translators and authors that were introduced to. But we see that this is a darker book. It's still hilarious. And in fact, the calamity is even more slapstick and comical. But there's literal darkness, a lot more than the light of the first one. The first one is steeped in the neoclassicism and neoplatonism of the Renaissance, where humanists were emerging and we were wanting to look back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and in our architecture and our literature and painting and so on, we were going after these classical ideas of perfection. But then, as we go into the Baroque, now we get into the grotesque and the fallibility of humanity, and we start to reject classical ideals and Platonic forms and ideas of perfection. Skepticism starts to come in. We're starting to work our way toward what will culminate in the French Revolution and the Enlightenment period, and scientific exactitude over intuition and artistic sensibility. So now, Book 2 brings the publication of the first Quixote and criticism of it into the story. So we as the reader are sort of watching the events unfold while they're seemingly being scripted ahead of time by characters in the book who have read the first Quixote. And then, of course, the narrator, interpreter, so on, they're coming along almost behind the events, just behind Sancho Panza and Don Quixote, and recording what happened. We're multiple levels removed from all of this. And there's so many times when the narrator or the editor steps out of the frame and looks at us and says, Cid Amite Benengeli, the original Muslim historian who told this, and now there's been an interpreter. Well, in Marginalia, Benengeli said blah, 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 but the commentary from the interpreter says blah, blah, blah. But also, tongue in cheek, the person who's telling us this is another layer of commentary and abstraction and interpretation. So we have to question, where is the real text? What is the real text? Do we have it? Can we say we have it? And furthermore, how exactly is it coming into being? Because of that and many other factors, Don Quixote, like Stephen Moore said, gets in there and grapples with literary studies, literary theory, more so than any other novel. Auerbach in Mimesis, he talks about Don Quixote's idée fixe, which is to return the tenets of chivalry and the picaresque and knight errantry into the present. You know, whenever it comes up against something that Quixote and his madness somehow can't reconcile, he always turns and blames enchanters. And these enchanters and evil spirits, in a way, to me, are sort of precursors to Descartes and his concept of the evil demon. You know, Descartes will publish this in about 30 years from when Quixote Part 2 was published. Descartes wants to go to as extreme into skepticism as he can. He wants to create as much as he can a tabula rasa and then start to go with first principles from there in his epistemological philosophy. But wherever he's deluded, he blames an evil demon. And this evil demon is exactly what we see in part 2, which again, like I said, is starting to anticipate science and rationality and logic over its antipodes. You know, there's a poem by Baudelaire, and it talks about how, you know, be drunk on wine, virtue, or poetry, whichever you choose, but be always drunk. And he's saying that basically whether you're choosing virtue or wine, like actual alcohol for intoxication, or poetry, you have to be drunk to make it through this life. And so if we transpose that over to the Quixote, we see that we are looking at what happens when someone chooses to become completely intoxicated on literature and only see the world as filtered through literature. There are so many times when, for example, a wooden horse shows up and Don Quixote says, oh, wait, think about Homer in the Iliad or I guess this would actually, I think it would actually be Virgil in the Aeneid. But, you know, think about how there was something in the belly of that horse that ultimately caused the fall of Troy. So check its belly. It's just a small example, but over and over, Don Quixote's entire reality is informed by the literature that he's immersed himself in. Like Dante choosing to write in his native Tuscan and Chaucer using the Middle English. Again, Cervantes is using Castilian. The great books, especially at that time, were Latin. Latin was still the ideal. But he justifies it here on page 588 of the John Rutherford Penguin edition. As regards what you say, sir, about your son's low opinion of poetry written in Spanish, it is my belief that he is making something of a mistake for the following reason. The great Homer did not write in Latin because he was a Greek, and Virgil did not write in Greek because he was a Roman. In short, all the ancient poets wrote in the languages that they were suckled on, and they did not go in search of foreign languages in which to express their noble concepts. Over and over, we see Don Quixote arcing back and forth between utter nonsense, usually when something to do with knight errantry is provoked, or disenchanting his beloved Dulcinea del Toboso, which that pretty much is the quest throughout this entire third sally, until his eventual disillusionment or desengaño. In one of his moments that even deals with knight errantry, when suddenly Don Quixote becomes a reincarnation of Cicero for his rhetorical abilities. He says, it is a subject, meaning knight errantry, that contains within itself all or most of the other subjects in the world, because the man who applies himself to it must be a jurist, to know the laws of distributive and commutative justice, so as to give to each what belongs to him and is due to him. He must be a theologian, so as to explain the Christian faith that he professes, clearly and distinctly whenever this is requested of him. He must be a physician, and especially an herbalist, or John Rutherford in his Britishness, a herbalist, so as to recognize in the midst of wastelands and wildernesses those herbs that have the power to cure wounds. He must be an astrologer so as to tell by the stars how many hours of the night have passed and what part of the world he's in. He must know mathematics because he will be in constant need of them. He must know how to swim. He must know how to mend a saddle and a bridle, to shoe a horse. He must be pure in his thoughts, chaste in his words, generous in his works, valiant in his deeds, long-suffering in his travails, compassionate towards the needy, and in short, a defender of the truth, even if it cost him his life to define it. And he goes on, and I'm skipping around, but just to give an idea of this high rhetorical style. But then he'll just arc back into his madness. Another major occupation of part two is that Sancho Panza comes to the foreground and almost switches roles with Don Quixote. He becomes a governor of an island. Well, I shouldn't quote governor, but because he does become the governor, but of an island. He's made to think by the Duke and Duchess, who play a lot of tricks on Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. He becomes a governor for just a short amount of time, and suddenly we see that even though he's ill-educated, he's extremely well-suited for the governorship. Or is he? Is he rash? Is he wise? It depends on which way you look at it. But Panza becomes, for a pretty good while, the central character of the Quixote. And they're separated for a little while. Don Quixote is sort of luxuriating in the Duke and Duchess's palace, while Panza is being the governor of this island. And in their separation, I, at least, started to sense just how real these characters and how strong their relationship and friendship really had become to me. Because I felt a sense of almost homesickness at not having them together and rejoiced inwardly when they came back together. Now, that's not to say that they don't bicker like they did in part one. In fact, if anything, the bickering between the two of them is intensified. There's so much humorous dialogue. And they go back and forth in their roles. So in part one, Don Quixote is mad and seeing things, reality becomes filtered through his madness. And then Sancho Panza becomes the voice of reason and sees things for what they are. But as Auerbach points out in the scene where Sancho is playing into the madness in order to continue an earlier lie that he gave concerning Dulcinea, now Sancho is deliberately pretending to see things the way that Don Quixote has been seeing them all along, and now Don Quixote is seeing them as they really are. It's a really interesting reversal of roles that Cervantes employs. Again, epistemology is of great concern during this time as we're moving out of the Middle Ages, out of the Renaissance, into the Baroque. And this is most highlighted in the episode of the Cave of Montesinos. The rhetoric is off the charts. There's a variety of styles. Cervantes can seemingly write in any style. One of my favorite elements of this, however, is Sancho Panza's seemingly infinite bounty of proverbs that he muddles together. And Don Quixote continues to get so frustrated and upset with him, telling him, Sancho, can't you just say something clear and straightforwardly just once in your life instead of stringing together these crazy proverbs? While the page from this island that Sancho is governing goes and actually visits the real wife and son and daughter of Panza, Teresa, the priest, listening to all these things and listening to the way the Panza family talks, says, I can only believe that every member of this breed of Panzas was born complete with a sack full of proverbs inside him. I haven't met a single one who doesn't reel them off at all hours of the day and in all his conversations. That is true, said the page, because my lord governor, Sancho, comes out with them all the time. And although lots are off the point, they're still good to listen to. And my lady, the Duchess, and the Duke are delighted with them. It struck me this time reading it. And again, I think I still favor Edith Grossman's translation. For anyone who hasn't read Don Quixote yet, go to the Grossman first. But it struck me this time reading part two that it's very much like that movie from, I think, the 1990s with Jim Carrey called The Truman Show. Now, the ending of this is, actually for me, it was a bit chilling. And I'm going to kind of dance around this for those who haven't read it. But The first time I read this ending, it was so abrupt that it just caught me off guard, and I was left kind of cold. But now, with a little more understanding of the context of Avellaneda's apocryphal Quixote, and the fact that Cervantes is one of the first novelists who's writing, trying to make a living at writing and make money off of it, and he sees Don Quixote and Sancho Panza as his creation. And so he sees Avellaneda has committed a huge offense of appropriation and almost like copyright violation. And so one of the things that he's rushing to do, and a lot of people think that his rush, as he was halfway through writing part two and found out about the Avellaneda, False Quixote, he wrote the rest of it in like 7 months, which is absurd. And his health was already very much in check. And it wouldn't be but 6 months after he finished part two that he died. So he never got to really realize any royalties from it anyway. You can tell he very much wants to put a nail in the coffin to make sure that nobody else can appropriate Don Quixote. We see in here he was requesting the certificate to deprive any author other than Cide Hamete Benengeli of the opportunity to bring him falsely back to life and write endless histories of his exploits. Sansón Carrasco, the young academic, and this figure also affords not only lots of comedic escapades as he messes with Don Quixote and actually ultimately causes his downfall and disillusionment or disengaño, but he writes a sonnet or a poem, and it ends with, "He had the luck with much ado to live a madman, yet die wise." And that's something that will really linger with me from the Quixote. Is it a privilege? Would it be a privilege to live through this entire life, a madman or a madwoman, but then at the last moment die wise? It bears serious thought. Faulkner was obsessed with it. Dostoevsky was obsessed with it. Melville was obsessed with it. The Quixote is one of the most monumental works of world literature. Forget about just the Western core. So much so that I almost feel a sense of loss at having finished it and knowing that I'm going to move on to other books. However, I then lift my spirits again when I think about the fact that we can own this book. We can have this as part of our personal library to come to again and again. It grows with you. So to end this second part of the Quixote, I will read the extremely short story from Franz Kafka called The Truth About Sancho Panza. Without making any boast of it, Sancho Panza succeeded in the course of years by feeding him a great number of romances of chivalry and adventure in the evening and night hours, in so diverting from himself his demon, whom he later called Don Quixote, that this demon thereupon set out uninhibited on the maddest exploits, which, however, for the lack of a preordained object, which should have been Sancho Panza himself, harmed nobody. A free man, Sancho Panza philosophically followed Don Quixote on his crusades, perhaps out of a sense of responsibility, and had of them a great and edifying entertainment to the end of his days. Wow. In one paragraph, Kafka gives us a reimagining of these figures of Sancho Panza and Don Quixote that really stop us in our tracks and reconsider what we've read.